Virginia, established by a private corporation and later converted into a royal colony, Maryland was founded in 1632 by a single wealthy family called the Calverts, headed by Lord Baltimore. They held absolute authority to dispose of 10 million acres of land, an authority given to them directly by the king. They also had to administer justice and establish a civil government in this area. All these powers they exercised, granting estates or manors to their friends and dividing other holdings into smaller farms for ordinary immigrants, was known as the manorial system. From all these tenants, that is, every settler in the colony, the family collected quit rents every year, fees for use of the land. The Calverts appointed a governor and a council to oversee their own interests, while allowing the largest landowners to dispose local justice in manorial courts and make laws for the entire colony in a representative assembly. Virginians liked nothing about Maryland. To begin with, the Calvert family was Catholic and had extended complete religious freedom to all Christians, making Maryland a haven for Catholics. Worse still, the Marylanders were a source of economic competition. 2,000 inhabitants had settled on Calvert holdings by 1640, virtually all of them planting tobacco on land coveted by the Virginians. But by the 1660s, with all of this tobacco being produced, overproduction was depressing tobacco prices, and wealthy planters reacted by putting even more prime coastal land into production. Newly freed servants had either to become tenants or try to establish farms to the west in Indian country. Meanwhile, export duties on tobacco helped plunge many small planters into crushing debt, and some were forced back into servitude. By 1676, 1/4 of Virginia's free white men remained landless and frustrated. As the discontent of the poor mounted, so did the worrying of big planters. The assembly of the colony lengthened terms of servitude, that is, lengthened terms of indentured servitude, hoping to limit the number of servants entering the free population. It curbed the political rights of landless men, hoping to stifle opposition by depriving them of the right to vote. But these measures only offset a spat of mutinies among servants and protesters over rising taxes among small planters, most notably the rebellion of 1676 in Virginia named Bacon's. Tension came to a head in 1676. The immediate spark to the rebellion was renewed fighting between desperate Indians and the expanding colonial population. Virginia's royal governor favored building forts to guard against Indians, but frontier farmers, usually those that had served a period of indentured servitude and then traveled west seeking cheap land, opposed his plan as expensive and an ineffective way to defend their scattered plantations. When they clamored for the expedition to punish the Indians, Nathaniel Bacon stepped forward to lead it. Wealthy and well-connected, Bacon had arrived recently from England, expecting to receive every favor from the royal governor, including permission to trade with the Indians from his frontier plantation holdings. But the governor and a few select friends already held a monopoly on Indian trade and did not allow Bacon to do this. When they declined to include Bacon, he took up the cause of the poor frontier neighbor. Other recent well-to-do immigrants who resented being excluded from the governor's circle of powerful friends also joined the cause to push for the extension of the Virginia colony's borders by absorbing Indian lands. In the summer of 1676, Bacon marched into Jamestown with a bloody of armed men and bullied the assembly into approving his expedition to kill Indians. While Bacon carried out that grisly business, slaughtering friendly as well as hostile natives, the governor rallied his supporters and declared Bacon a rebel. Bacon retaliated by turning his force against those led by the governor. Both sides sought allies by offering freedom to servants and slaves willing to join their ranks. Many were willing. For months, the followers of Bacon and the governor plundered one another's plantations. In September 1676, Bacon reduced Jamestown itself to a mound of ashes by burning the city, or I should say the settlement. Only his death, that is, the death of Nathaniel Bacon from dysentery, snuffed out the rebellion. After the rebellion, the rich planters in the Chesapeake fought less among themselves and cooperated more. In Virginia, older leaders and newer arrivals divided the spoils of political office. By acting together in legislative assemblies, the planter elite managed to curb the power of royal and proprietary governors for decades to come. But the greater unity among the Chesapeake's leading families did little to ease the region's most fundamental problem: the sharp inequality of white society. The gulf between rich and poor planters, which had been etched even more deeply by the troubled tobacco economy, persisted long after Bacon's rebellion. All that saved white society in the Chesapeake from renewed crisis and conflicts was the growth of something far darker, and that is African slavery. Like the tobacco plants that spread across Powhatan's land, a labor system based on African slavery was an on-the-ground innovation. Both early promoters and planters preferred paying for English servants to importing alien African slaves. Black slaves, because they served for life, were far more expensive than white workers, white indentured workers, who served for only several years. Because neither white nor black immigrants lived very long, cheaper servant labor was the logical choice. The black population of the Chesapeake, as a result, remained small for most of the 17th century. In fact, it only constituted about 5% of all inhabitants living in the region in 1675. Africans had arrived in Virginia by 1619, most likely via the Dutch. A number of changes after caused planters to invest, however, more heavily in slaves than in servants. First, as death rates in the Chesapeake began to drop, slaves became a more profitable investment. Although they were more expensive to buy than servants, planters could now expect to get many years of work from their slaves. Equally important, masters would have a title to the children that slaves were now living long enough to have. At the same time, the influx of white servants was falling off, just as the pool of available black labor was expanding. At the same time, the influx of white servants was falling off, just as the pool of available black laborers was expanding. And most of that can be attributed to the Atlantic slave trade. From 1492 to 1820, enslaved African migrants outnumbered European migrants to the New World by nearly 5 to 1. Put differently, before the 20th century, African workers did most of the heavy lifting in the economies of the American colonies. For a century after Columbus's arrival, the traffic in slaves to the Americas had numbered a few thousand annually. But as sugar cultivation steadily prospered after 1600, slave imports rose to 19,000 a year during the 17th century, and then mushroomed to 60,000 a year in the 18th century, when the English colonies stabilized. All told, as many as 20 million African people were captured in West and Central Africa between 1700 and 1850. Some 9 million among them entered the American colonies as slaves. Those that did make it faced a number of challenges with reference to staying alive. The first year in the colonies was the most deadly for new, unseasoned slaves. The sickle cell genetic trait gave them a greater immunity to malaria than Europeans, but slaves were highly susceptible to respiratory infections. 1/4 of all Africans died during their first year in the Chesapeake, and among Carolina and Caribbean slaves, mortality rates were far higher. In addition to the new disease environment, Africans had to adapt to lives without freedom in a wholly unfamiliar country and culture. Exchanging a labor system based on servitude for one based on slavery transformed the Chesapeake society. Most obviously, the number of Afro-Virginians rose sharply. By 1740, for instance, 40% of all Virginians were black, and most of those were African-born. Unlike many African men and women who had arrived earlier from the Caribbean, these new inhabitants had little familiarity with English language and culture. This larger, more distinctively African community was also locked into a slave system that was becoming even more rigid and demeaning. By the late decades of the 17th century, new laws made it more difficult for masters to free slaves. Other legislation systematically separated the races by providing free black settlers from having white servants and outlawing interracial marriage and sexual relationships. The legal code encouraged white contempt for black Virginians in a variety of other ways. The new laws both reflected and encouraged racism among white colonists of all classes. Deepening racial hatred, in turn, made it unlikely that poor white planters, tenants, and servants would ever join with poor black slaves to challenge the privileges of the rich and wealthy grape planters. Instead of identifying with the plight of slaves, which they had much more in common with, the Chesapeake's poor white residents considered black Virginians their natural inferiors. They could pride themselves on sharing with wealthy white gentlemen the same skin color, and on being their equals in the eyes of the law. The leaders of the Chesapeake colonies cultivated unity among white inhabitants by improving economic prospects for freed servants and lesser planters. Let's now turn to the Carolinas.